Hi, I'm Reggie Turner. I'm here with Jim Miller and Terrence Moore. The Flip Side starts right now. Welcome to the show. Today we're joined again. It's been about 2 years since you've been with us, but we're joined by the Department of Transportation's Dr. Julie Schablitsky. Your title's no longer Chief Archaeologist.
No, it's Chief of Cultural Resources.
Chief of Cultural Resources. Well, Julie, welcome to the show. It is awesome to have you back.
I'm happy to be here again.
Awesome. In getting into things, there's a lot of things we want to cover tonight, but let's talk a little bit about why does the Department of Transportation have archaeologists?
Well, that's a very good question. The reason we have archaeologists and even architectural historians is because there are federal and state laws that require us to consider our impacts on the cultural environment when we do infrastructure projects. So, for example, if we're going to put a bridge in or widen a highway, we have to get out there and determine whether or not there's an archaeological site or an historic bridge that we can somehow design around, or if we are going to impact it, how can we minimize that damage? Or and sometimes if we can't, then we have to mitigate those impacts. So there are laws, but we also have public outreach program that is great because it's a way for us to share some of the exciting work that we're doing, like the Harriett Tubman work.
Yes.
Well, and also our local cabin here. I think we were the beneficiary of some of that. So the work that is, or the community piece of this is really a bonus, right?
Yes, exactly. It's cultural stewardship. It's a way for us to give back to the people of Maryland and the traveling public in general. So our goal is not only just to, again, determine how and where we're going to impact cultural resources, but to find sites that might have a transportation link that we can then partner with different groups in the community, whether it's federal, state, or local groups, to try and bring these great historical stories to the public.
So there's a big difference in my mind between archaeology and cultural resources. Archaeology, to me, means really old. Cultural resources means potentially old, but also potentially just impactful. Is there a time frame of resources that you're looking at? Does it have to be before a certain date, or how does that work?
Well, that's a good question. There is a date where we have to begin to look, and usually it's about 50 years or old, which many of us could consider ourselves cultural resources.
I am a cultural resource for sure.
Yeah, so, but cultural resources is kind of a catch-all term for anything that's archaeological or historical, building structures. Even things like culverts, of all things, can be a cultural resource, something that's valuable that we need to somehow manage in building infrastructure projects.
Okay.
And I know you don't work alone, so how large is your team?
Well, we have about a dozen archaeologists and architectural historians that work for MDOT, primarily at the State Highway Administration, but we also have several consulting firms that also have these specialists and technical staff that we can then borrow upon. So if there's a large archaeological excavation, sometimes we're going to need a dozen people out there in addition to just the people sitting in the office in Baltimore, for example. So we pull on all sorts of research, this project's going, and we do the right thing by the law, but also by the resource.
Well, that's the other question I have. In terms of the reception that you get from these communities in which you work, are people happy that we're looking at these types of things and making accommodations? Or what is the reception you're getting from the communities?
Yeah, sometimes there's some concern, I think, in general, like people might question, why are we spending money on archaeology or the recording of an historical building? Like, what's the point? But I haven't seen this in this region of the United States. They really do find these historic buildings and these archaeological sites very important and part of their identity. And it's really a way that I think communities can, rebuild themselves. And when you have that identity, it does nothing but, I think, make us very, very excited about what can happen.
I know we're going to talk about the cabin. I know we're going to talk about the Harriett Tubman project. But in terms of just really old, what is the oldest things that you have found as part of your mission?
Well, archaeologists in general, usually it's about 10,000 years old. That sometimes sites can go that old when they're from native people, native cultures. So a lot of times those are out west in the Northwest and other places. But here it's like really my interest is historical archaeology, which is the more recent past. So the mid 1600s all the way up until the very, very early 1900s is usually what I like to research on.
So you found artifacts from what I'll call Native American populations?
Yeah, like Native people, they go back sometimes 10,000 years, and those are known as archaic sites. So a lot of times a lot of stone spear points that can be found and that sort of thing. And those sites can also be in this part of, this area of Maryland. Wow. So it's exciting to be able to come across something that old.
Yeah.
Julie, I know that often when we talk and I ask you about other digs and other opportunities, you always talk about it needing to have a transportation link.
Yes.
Explain to us what that means when you say a transportation link.
Well, it's a transportation link is anything that can be linked back to either a road. So if you have an archaeological site that's near a road, and you can then look at how that site played into the movement of people or goods, how roads change over time, how they can sometimes benefit but also be a detriment to communities. When you move a road from one neighborhood outside of that neighborhood, it might cause the demise of that community. And so we look at that and we try to learn from what's happened in the past so that we can not repeat those mistakes.
Because I remember part of our conversation when it came to Jonathan Street, we talked about Route 11 and the fact that it was the main thoroughfare, and then in the 80s that was changed, where Route 11 was moved up to where it is now at Burhan's. Is that one of the reasons why you were able to do a dig within our community? Absolutely.
It gave us a chance and opportunity to examine what we did decades before and how it did impact a community, and how by, a lot of times people think of roadways as kind of busy and noisy and not really something you want in your community. But in this sort of situation, the ability to have a roadway through a community brought life and brought opportunity and people and customers. And so you have to look at roads not always in the negative, but really in the positive. And in this case, it was a perfect example of moving a road out of a community did have a negative impact.
Right. Because, the other thing is that sometimes roads are used to divide communities. I can think of other communities, Pine Street, where, and I believe that's more towards the shore, where there was race riots that happened because of populations living on opposite sides of the street. And we had Miss Carolyn Sterling here talking about the other side of the track. Sometimes railroad tracks are used as kind of the dividing lines, and we have some of that in our community within the Johnson Street community as well. Do you see that often when you dig in different locales?
Well, what ends up happening is sometimes we end up revisiting places where we put, for example, interstate or a large highway. And when we go back to these communities, we're looking at division. We're looking how this highway has separated a community and divided it. And this happened all across the United States, especially in the 60s and 70s, that mid-20th century time period, where you saw this combination of white flight and urban renewal. So these highways would somehow take people out of the cities to get them away, but they'd also then be impacting all these important neighborhoods and these immigrant places. And by doing that, you did destroy communities. So I do see that as someone who's also an anthropologist and someone who is very sensitive to descendant communities, is that we'll go to these places, we'll see how we've impacted cemeteries sometimes neighborhoods, we've demolished places. And again, it's all about, I think in highway and transportation, you want to try and balance that, infrastructure project, right? So you want to try and thread this needle between the needs of the community, which is having a place and ability to get from point A to point B, but also try and have a little impact on communities, trying to preserve historical resources, and even the natural environment. So it's really kind of a hard balance to do, especially when you're in such a congested area. But we're a new highway administration, we're a new transportation department, where these sorts of things are things we think about on a regular basis, and we're doing better. And I am very proud to be part of MDOT, where I can now go into these communities and I can say, well, we're going to be doing this project, help us plan better, make sure that your voice is in this planning process. So, and that's what we do as archaeologists and planners now in the 21st century, is we go out to the communities and we give them that voice so that they can sometimes teach us how to do better.
So in terms of the road system, there are some roads that are put in by the state, there are others that are put in by counties, potentially cities or towns. Can you help at any of those levels? So in other words, if the city of Hagerstown is building a road into a development, is that something that you might become involved in or no?
We only stick on state roads, state maintained state roads. Now being at the Maryland Department of Transportation Secretary's office, there's also the port, there's the Aviation Administration, there's our ability to look at and consider cultural resources is not just along state roads now, it's along a lot of different places. So I'm just in the infancy of growing these programs now to be able to look at these different places. But I'm excited because there's a lot of potential there for looking not just at state roads, but like I said, aviation and ports.
Well, it seems like there's a lot of history to be learned.
There is, it's everywhere.
That may be lost. In terms of your type of job, when was that introduced at the state level? And was it first introduced at the Secretary's office, or did it start out in the Motor Vehicle Administration? What is the history of your position?
Well, it goes back to the 80s. The laws are from the 60s and 70s usually, and so that's when people began to consider impacts, and then they began to realize, oh, we need actual technical expertise here. So they began to really hire archaeologists during the 1980s. So I believe it was about 1985, 1986, when I think it was the U.S. Geological Survey ended up hiring the archaeologists to help the State Roads Commission, eventually State Highway Administration, do the archaeology. So the State Highway Administration has always had that core group of cultural resource experts there from the 1980s. And since that time, they've been growing and doing better and working closely with the Maryland Historical Trust, which is a regulatory agency, and helps us also consider impacts to these important historic sites.
I'm sorry.
I have just one more quick follow-up question. The laws that you mentioned, are they state laws? Are they federal laws?
The state laws, the federal and state laws are what we follow. So there's both.
Okay.
And sometimes there's even local ordinances at the county level that we need to work with, maybe permitting in that case.
Interesting.
You mentioned a lot about community, and you touched on your community engagement. I know when you were here in Hagerstown, excuse my ignorance, the only archaeologist I knew was Indiana Jones growing up as a kid.
That's my guy.
So, and it was just amazing watching the community kind of gather around and watch things happen and watch your team work through the progress. And at the same time, it wasn't closed off or excluding the community as well. Talk to me a little bit why you do that and what that community engagement looks like, or maybe some of the problems you've had, with some of the communities as well, as you kind of go in and kind of not disrupt, but introduce something that's completely new.
Yeah, so an archaeological site that's open like that, we were getting all sorts of children and like adults, women, men, all over who were just walking by and saw us and like, what are you doing? And would ask. And we also had people across the street kind of shouting over to us, and we said, well, come on over, we'll show you what we're finding. So we love that because it's such an organic way to share what we're finding, what we're learning about a place where they live. But sometimes you're right. I mean, we're going to be going into a place, and a lot of times people have, they're not sure about what we're going to be doing, or if we're going to be doing it to help them. So it's sometimes an educational period and lessons that we need to teach them about what we do, why we're doing it, and why it's important for them to tell us what they want to learn.
From a technology standpoint, what kind of technology do you use, modern day technology to do some of your work?
Well, one of the most important tools to us now is ground penetrating radar. And GPR is, when you look at it, it seems like a box with wheels sometimes on it, and someone pushes it along the ground in these transects. And it's about as exciting as watching the lawn get mowed. So it's not very exciting to watch, but when this is happening, you have radar waves going through the ground, and when they hit something kind of different than the surrounding soil, they'll bounce back and it'll read differently in the screen and in the data. So the geophysicists would take all the data they collected after they did their transects, they'd go back to their computer, they'd look at the data, and then they'd start to interpret what they're finding. So if you have these changes that are, for example, in a burial ground, a cemetery, when you have 6 foot by 3 foot holes in a certain west to east orientation, then you can probably be assured that you're likely looking at a burial ground.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Excellent.
So a couple just follow-up questions, and I know you want to get us to a break, but first of all, any of the projects that you've worked on where you've been sent in pre-project to look at things, have any of those projects changed as a result of the findings that you have? Have you? Okay, so there's been...
Yeah, often. In fact,
Really?
yes. And that's the thing. That's the great thing about the DOT and the planning aspect of it is before, when you start to say, okay, we're going to do a highway here and we're going to expand out this direction, before they even really start to design the construction project, we go in to determine where these archaeological sites are, where there are historic buildings, districts, and we let them know this is the location of these sites. Can you design around them? And they want to design around them because, one, it's the right thing to do, but it's also very, it's expensive to have to mitigate the impacts to these sites. And the community has a voice in a lot of these planning projects and all the planning projects, really. So your goal here is to try and avoid cultural resources, buildings, archaeological sites, cemeteries at all costs for many different reasons.
Wow. If we were to look at other states in, in the Union, would they have similar departments, divisions, employees?
Yes, I used to work at the Oregon Department of Transportation all the way on the West Coast. And just from being in this field for over 20 years in the DOT, I can tell you right now that there are DOTs across, every state has one.
Right.
And they're also the largest funders of archaeological research and architectural history in each of their states because they do so many projects, and they're very high, they're expensive, and they move a lot of ground. So, yep, all across the nation.
Yeah, and I knew they had Department of Transportation, but I wondered if they had the archaeological resources and presence that Maryland has. And it sounds like yes.
They have to, but I will say that Maryland is one of the best.
We're going to keep you here. We want to transition and talk a little bit about Harriett Tubman and the exciting things because 2 years ago you were just starting on that project when you were here. So we'll talk about that after the break, okay? Excellent. We're going to have more with Dr. Julie Schablitsky after the break. Welcome back to the show. Thank you for staying with us. We're still joined by Dr. Julie Schablitsky of the Department of Transportation, Chief Cultural Officer. Did I butcher that?
Chief of Cultural Resources, that's close.
There we go.
Yeah.
Fair enough. So let's transition and talk about, I know that Governor Hogan named this the year of Harriett Tubman. This is her bicentennial birthday. There was an opening celebration. There's been there are events that are taking place all year round. But can you talk about the event where some of the artifacts were displayed of her father's home at the state park there,
Yeah.
and that's in Dorchester County, correct?
Right, correct, just south of Cambridge.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about that event and how that came together.
Yeah, so this is the 200th anniversary of Harriett Tubman's birth. She was born, what we were able to surmise, around March 1822. So everyone's celebrating that birthday now through all sorts of different events across the state. As archaeologists, we're excited because just the year before, last April, we announced that we had found the home of Harriett Tubman's father, Ben Ross. And that was a wonderful thing. And I didn't know if we were going to find it or not because it's literally the proverbial needle in the haystack. I mean, this is the place where Harriett Tubman grew up and learned to navigate the marsh and the rivers. Is literally the place that time forgot. If you go there, it's wet, it's swampy, it's wooded, there's fields. And when we ended up looking for that exact spot on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service property, we didn't know where it could be. And so we began that search, and we did end up finding it. Those artifacts were then taken and displayed at the museum, the Harriett Tubman Underground Railroad National Park Museum, that's operated by the state. And a lot of people came to see those broken bits of ceramics, pipes, buttons, and they were moved by that because no one knew or had seen any of those sorts of artifacts that Harriett Tubman would have seen and had access to.
So at that event in March, did you give a presentation?
Yes, I gave a presentation about how we discovered Harriett Tubman's father's home and about any future work. So it was well received. The place was full. It was
Yes.
So there was a lot of people in attendance and a lot of good questions, a lot of excitement about the discovery and about the artifacts.
Awesome. Terrence?
So what did you use to mark the spot? I'm sure it was a vast area. So how did you kind of hone in to where that location would have been?
Yeah, it's a great question because it was the way that we were able to at least kind of get our arms around where we should look is that the first thing we do as historical archaeologists is we hit their archives. So we looked at historical documents, looked at historical maps, we looked at the former Anthony Thompson plantation or his farm location, and we saw that in 1836 there was a will of Anthony Thompson that freed Ben Ross in 1836, so he had to work 5 more years, and so by 1840 he'd be freed, and he was given 10 acres to live upon until his death. And it talked about old Ben's place, so we knew that he had 10 acres there, but we also saw other documents that mentioned how the Ben's place was down below the field, and that it was supposed to be, down by the Blackwater River, Indian Landing. So all these spots gave us this search area. And if you go there today, it looks pretty much almost exactly like it looked when Harriett Tubman was walking around. And so we began by going along this road, digging shovel test pit, shovel test pit, shovel test pit. And after we reached about 700 of those pits, I was getting frustrated because I was thinking there'd be sites all over the place. People had been living there for thousands of years. There's native people, there's enslaved people, there's free people. And I just expected to find broken ceramics and nails that were representing people's homes all on this road. And we didn't. We're coming up with just some 20th century, stuff, and it was just, are you kidding me? And the crew was getting frustrated. And I said, we can't give up, but let me go ahead and grab my metal detector, and I'm gonna go out there, and I'm just gonna sweep along this road to see if I can at least find something that can help us. And we kept on digging. Within 2 days, after 1,000 holes, we found the site.
You truly found buried treasure. It
Yeah,
was worth
literally.
50 cents originally, but it was worth so much more. Oh, that's amazing.
So talk to me about, you said these holes. What does that process look like?
So yeah, so shovel test pits. What those are, and there's a long road, and we simply just put our crews, which we had about 12 archaeologists out there, and they'd go along and kind of leapfrog across above each other and along this line, digging holes every 20-25 feet or so in a grid-like pattern, looking for the presence or absence of artifacts. So they would dig down, it would be wet mud, they'd be pushing it through their screens, just looking for anything. And they were just coming up empty, but eventually at one site we did get to the point where we're getting just crumbs of artifacts, but those artifacts were of the age we wanted, that 1800s to 1840s time period. So when we found that, we thought this is great because Ben's 10 is supposed to be somewhere in our search area, and if this is the only spot that's a candidate for it, it's kind of guilty by exclusion in a way.
And the Ben's 10 reference, I know it's geographical reference. Talk to us about what that is.
Yeah, so Ben Ross obviously is the
Right.
name of Harriett Tubman's father, and then the 10 it refers to his 10 acres he was given by his enslaver.
Okay, cool.
So not finding anything else around was actually a benefit.
Yes.
Because then there was nothing to really contrast or compare it to or trying to define which one is which.
Right, I didn't have the argument. I didn't have to worry about multiple sites competing for that title. It was just, all right, that was easy, but not too easy.
So after all that frustration, right, you dug up 700 sites before you
1,000 holes.
altogether.
Yes.
But when you finally found the coin and you were on to something, like, how did that change with the team? Like, what was the emotions of the team like when you found that discovery? Like, how did things go from that point?
Well, it was interesting because as archaeologists, we're very suspicious, and we're very much like, show us the science, show us the facts. And what we were really given at the end of that first phase of that project was we had a contender for Ben Ross's place. But we needed to dig more, we needed to have larger excavation units, and we needed more artifacts to unequivocally state that this is indeed where X marks the spot, and this is where Ben was, along with Harriett when she was there as a teenager. So we were all kind of cautiously optimistic. And we basically set it aside that November, and we returned a year ago, And we're able to, in a sense, seal the deal by doing more excavations, because we're looking for not only a site that dates from that 1800, 1840 time period, but also we had to have artifacts that suggested a home versus an industrial site. We had to have artifacts that suggested also a building. So what we're coming up with were broken ceramics, broken bottles, pipe stems, buttons, and also bricks, nails, and window glass. So all those sorts of artifacts are saying to us, this is the place. And we're not done digging yet. We're really kind of in a race against time because of sea level rise. So that's a frustrating thing, I think, with us right now, is that we need to get back out there this summer when it's a lot drier, so the water table is not kind of coming up and inundating our site.
Mm-hmm. Were you able to find out anything about the family's diet?
Yes, great question. And I love faunal material, which are simply animal bones that are left behind. And that's one of the ways that we can determine we're usually on a site of people who were impoverished or enslaved, is that there are people who are eating the cuts of meat that might be the heads or the limbs of domestic animals like cows and pigs and sheep. Also, we find usually in enslaved sites are bones that suggest that these people were hunting or gathering for additional food because they weren't given enough food to eat. So we're finding in this sort of situation a lot of, like turtle. We'll find muskrat. We'll find a lot of fish, oysters, even crab. So any sort of faunal remains, animal remains we find that are very heavy on wild-caught game is speaking to us that these people were hungry and they weren't given enough.
Yeah. Terrence.
No, when you said crab, it just reminded me that I know a lot of people believe that crab and lobster were the food of the wealthy, and we look today, but it was the food of the impoverished, many years ago as well. And that kind of connection to what food and history ties together as well. And you kind of mentioned as well the time of year, the ideal time to actually do a dig. When is that? You said in summer?
Well, it depends, because in this part of the country, in Dorchester County, it's wet and it's swampy, and during the summertime in August, it's full of biting flies and mosquitoes, wood ticks, deer ticks. It's horrible, but it's also very dry in August. So when's the best time to go? It just depends. When we were there this last month, it was very wet, but no snakes, no bugs. It was fine that way, but we had to really contend with water, and that's why we were able to get deep on one site, and we had to stop, and we said we have to come back in August.
Wow. So let me understand. So the farm, how did Ben Ross get the farm? When he was freed from slavery, it was given to him?
Well, Ben Ross lived on Anthony Thompson's farm probably since he's been a young child, a little boy. And so he, in a sense, was there into his, into being an older man. He raised his family for at least part of the time on that location. So when Anthony Thompson died, he left Ben 10 acres to live on and used the wood on that land and all of his land until his death. But Ben didn't stay there very long. He was gone with Harriett Tubman eventually, so he left to go north.
Do we have any clues as to what Ben did after slavery, other than inherit this or other than get this land? Did he have some kind of, was he an entrepreneur, or did he have any kind of, how did he survive?
So Ben Ross was a timberman. He was someone who oversaw the timber operations at Anthony Thompson's farm. So a lot of times when we think of people who are enslaved, we think of cotton plantations or tobacco plantations up here. But in that part of Dorchester County, Anthony Thompson made his money on timber, on wood. It was very, very valuable, and it was used to make ships and build buildings and homes, and it was fuel. So he had a large business there, and so Ben oversaw a lot of the people there cutting wood and then shipping it on the Blackwater River through Stewart's Canal up to ports into Baltimore. So he oversaw all of that, and then once he was freed around 1840, he continued to work in that business.
Interesting.
Excellent. And for our viewing audience, the name of the park is the Harriett Tubman Underground Railroad State Park and Visitor Center. And the artifacts are still being shown there in Dorchester County. And how long will the artifacts be shown?
Well, they were only shown during the month of March.
Oh, just
so
in March.
Yes, but they'll eventually come back to that museum at a later point. So we do plan to have them return.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
Well, will the artifacts travel around the state, or there are no plans for anything of that nature?
At this point, we're still in the process of processing the artifacts, so they're eventually going to go to a repository in the state repository down in southern Maryland, and then anybody can have access to those artifacts to display and exhibit those. And I'm happy to help with that as well.
And some good news is a little teaser. That's happening right here in Washington County right now with the artifacts you found at the cabin, and working with our Washington County Museum of Fine Arts. So that's a great process, and it's a great way to get engaged even after the dig as well.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
Thank you.
Yes.
So you mentioned the rising water levels and how that could impact. In your best guess, what is the time frame we have to still access this, all else being equal?
The Ben Ross site is threatened. I would say within 5 to 10 years, it's not going to be able to be excavated. It'll be inundated, completely underwater, at least to the point where if you dig down, the water will be just right there.
And is there water today that would have, is there water since this all was buried that may have impacted what you found?
Yeah, so historically it was a lot drier. The entire Dorchester County was much drier than it is today, and so because of that, what's growing on the land today is a little bit different than what it was back then. Today we have, the invasive species Phragmites is choking a lot of this area. There's even some, species like the Sitka deer, which are like these small elk that are also there that weren't around when Harriett Tubman was there. So the inundation that's happened just in the last few decades is impacting the archaeology because it makes it difficult for us to excavate. We need those soils that are intact. We don't need a big mud hole to dig in.
Right.
So, and the other thing too is that metal artifacts are important to us, but those are becoming all rusty and they just look like big blobs when we take them out of the ground. So it's impacting the artifacts. They're decomposing a lot faster, and just digging in general is a little more difficult.
How deep do you dig in those holes?
Well, it just depends because did people put fill on top of that? Was there a lot of erosion from the soil that would have gone into the rivers that caused siltation of those rivers and creeks? So in this case, a lot of it was logged, and so a lot of soil did end up in the streams and rivers. So it's pretty shallow. We're only down about not even a foot, and we're finding Ben Ross's place. But in other places, it might be a little bit deeper because they may have brought fill in or done something with the ground to build it up, and then the archaeology just simply was capped.
So, and I wanted to touch on that too. Because they were cutting down trees, they made that area a little bit more at risk as well.
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Erosion just, once you remove vegetation, it does increase the. And whether you're clearing for logging or for agricultural fields, they definitely cause a lot of the sedimentation into the rivers and creeks.
Excellent. Julie, we want to spend some time talking to you in regards to 2 years later, kind of your final thoughts in regards to the Jonathan Street project in our community and what's come out of that. Mm-hmm. So stay with us. Stay with us. We'll have more with Dr. Julie Schablitsky after the break. Welcome back to the show, Dr. Julie. Let's jump right back into it. Before we start talking about our local community here, tell us what's in the works. What do you have? What's up next for you?
Well, the next thing that we're doing again is going to be Harriett Tubman's birthplace and also her childhood home. Those are two separate locations. So we're looking at sites across that part of Maryland. We're trying to reconstruct her landscape. We're also interested in looking at different sites down in southern Maryland as eventually the 400th anniversary of the landing of the Ark and the Dove by Father Andrew White. So the 400th anniversary of Maryland is coming up the next 12 or so years. So we're getting excited about that. So I'm looking for sites down in southern Maryland right now, but I'm also happy to come back to this part of Maryland as well.
Well, there's a list of things that I would like for you to cover, and we've had some talks about this because, one of those sites here locally would be John Brown's farm.
Oh, yes.
And what we've talked about is around the Spring House would be one of those prime sites. And I know the owner, Spriggs Lynn, would be very amenable to that. So I'm definitely going to be reaching back out to see if we can make that connection.
Yeah, we'll try and find a transportation link.
Yes, absolutely. Jim.
So in terms of further west in Maryland and here, have you done any projects there, or is there anything planned at this point further west?
Not at this time, but we always have our eyes open for any opportunities, and people are also welcome to reach out to us to see how, see if we want to partner on something. So,
do you find that the majority of your work, and it's probably an obvious answer here, is in more the suburban or rural areas, or is it more in the city? Obviously, they do more transportation projects in the city, so that might be obvious, but.
Yeah,
what's your sense?
Yeah, it's kind of all over. It's both. You can get rural as well as in the cities. A lot of times when you think cities, there's a lot of people there, but there's also been a lot of disturbance. So our job isn't to necessarily save everything or dig everything up, because a lot of times you do get this huge amount of disturbance that's happened over time, and so not a lot of survives as for an archaeologist to go look at. But a lot of times you do have buildings. So in more urban places, architectural history, historic buildings and structures sometimes are more intact and interesting. But rural places also have beautiful landscapes that you can find. But you find archaeology, it's everywhere, it's ubiquitous.
Does the scope of what you do, would it extend to historic sites, let's say the C&O Canal, which obviously has a transportation link, or the Antietam battlefield?
Yeah, a lot of times we do have transportation routes that do run through or adjacent to those, so absolutely.
Yeah, that would be fun.
Mm-hmm.
Canal, I bet, would be great fun.
Yeah.
And Antietam too.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned, you partner and reach out. How do people contact you and get you engaged in a project in their communities?
Well, usually they seem to find Nick Redding.
Another friend of the show.
Yeah. So as executive director of Preservation Maryland, he seems to say, hey, Julie, I've got this opportunity. I'm like, oh, really? Tell me about it. And that's how I ended up here in Hagerstown working on Jonathan Street Cabin. But yeah, so usually people reach out. They can email me, or they can find Nick. So
don't say email you, because the show goes out to quite a few people, and everyone thinks they have a historic site in their backyard at some point in time.
Well, usually it's important to work with state or federal, even county representatives, to go ahead and form partnerships to see if it makes sense to work together.
Great.
Excellent. In transition and talking about the Jonathan Street community, the one thing that I'll say is, what your team explained to me that was the most impactful. Number one, you did a history of the property. So you had a deed chain of everyone who owned the property. Mm-hmm. So we found out that Annie Bentley, a black woman, was the first African American to own the property. And we're starting to now, historians are digging and learning more about her, and that she inherited other property from her father. And for me as a financial advisor, seeing generational wealth being built during Reconstruction is really exciting. I mean, I even take off my Indiana Turner hat, for that. That's exciting. The other thing that your team explained is that the African Americans that inhabited the cabin during Reconstruction were eating high on the hog. And what that said to me is that wealth was being built in the black community during Reconstruction. Those are the two most impactful things that I saw. Tell me what was impactful to you in regards to what's been found and just reflections over the past 2 years.
Well, what I've noticed is that sometimes certain sites across Maryland seem to have this life in them, and it keeps on giving and giving and giving. And I found when I first arrived at this Jonathan Street Cabin, I looked at it and it's such a small, humble building, so unassuming. And I didn't know what I was going to find in the backyard, but I knew that there was something important that drew me to it. And so when we began to excavate, and then we began to step back and we began to share our stories, and you shared the stories with the public, and Nick was out there with the stories, I noticed that there was this huge energy around that.
Yes.
There was this, people were attracted to it. We made 6 small Maryland Public Television videos. Out of all the ones across the state, there were more views about Jonathan Street Cabin than any of the other ones, and even more than Harriett Tubman's place. So to me, that's telling me that there's something important here, and this little cabin has really inspired the entire community and the entire state to remember who it was and to remember the people that made it their home.
I would also argue that the marketing has been pretty good on that.
Yeah.
The story wrote itself. And
I have no doubt about that.
And I agree with what you're saying about the energy. There was just a buzz in the community. I mean, from the media that was showing up to, kids that were like peeking around the porch, and and hey, when's Reggie going to get here?
Yeah.
You say, hey, somebody came looking for you today.
Yeah.
Just all of those things. It was just such an amazing time, and to actually to get to spend some time with your team and see their process and have an opportunity to to get my man hours in with the trial was super exciting.
Well, and the other thing is, I think the fact that you and your team really invited people to the site, not, hey, stay away, come in, tell us what you have to say and see what we found.
Yeah.
I think that builds, that's amazing.
And Terrence, this really teases and lead, if you want to share more about what's on the horizon for our community based on Dr. Julie's work.
No, absolutely. You mentioned it. Community and collaboration is important, and it's a story that continues to kind of unfold. And you offered up a great opportunity as well for other organizations in our community to partner to come in and be a part of that story. One of those organizations is being the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts, which wanted to make a stronger connection with the community and celebrate the community as well. And because of that, a project was created that's going to take those artifacts and put them on display at the museum. There's also been a local artist who has been commissioned to interpret your work in some degree, and his artwork is actually going to be hung up in the museum as well, and it's going to be open to the public. And that exhibit is going to run from May 19th to Juneteenth as well, and be open to the community to come in, partake, and also contribute their stories and their pictures to a wall of memories that will unify a community. So I know your work is a lot of research and digging and getting your hands truly in the dirt, but it also has unified a community in a way that continues to bear fruit, 2 years later, and hopefully decades forward. So I want to thank you for that, and we hope that you have the opportunity to come out and partake in that exhibit as well.
Absolutely.
Because we would love to hear your voice and hear your interpretation, and let more people hear how you did the work in the community that has led to a development or revitalization in the community that was much needed. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank
Jim.
you.
Yeah, I've seen it firsthand, and I started to see it through these folks. But the energy that it has generated has just been amazing in my view, and I think this is I don't know how it could be any more successful. And I know we still don't know who's going to own the property, but I know it has to be owner occupied, which is a great thing.
Yes.
So I think there's more history to be had. Is there anything that remains from your perspective to be done at that site?
I think that the people in the community that you inspire will bring those opportunities to you. Again, I think this is like you all echoed, that this is just a site that's going to keep on giving and keep on sharing and keep on teaching.
I think it's an amazing testimony to that community, that what you said earlier about the fact that it had gotten more hits than the Harriett Tubman site. I think that's amazing.
That is absolutely amazing to think how this little obscure cabin that you would not see unless someone told you exactly where it was, because the house in front of it kind of butts out so you can't see it.
Right.
And it's just so unassuming that you would miss it.
And to the naysayers that say we shouldn't spend money on this type of thing, yeah, we should.
And I'm waiting for the first child to come out of that community that becomes an archaeologist.
Yes.
There you
That's
go.
a story that
Or historian.
or
Yeah.
historian
Or
that I,
genealogist.
Well, that's exactly right. We have
or
no
archivist.
idea, those kids that visited the site, we
Yes.
have no idea how we've impacted their lives forever just in a 10 or 20 or 30-minute visit to that site.
And of the several documentaries, I know that they're being shown within the school systems as well. They're being used as a teaching tool, the MPT, also the HCC, and the other ones as well. And then, the larger project that's coming out of this is the documentary that's going to be coming out next year by Three Rose Communication. And you interviewed with them, and that's going to be a huge project that's now going to give that and the constructs of the community national attention as well.
Well, and hopefully other states see this and step up their efforts, really, because this is important nationwide. It's not just important in Hagerstown or the Eastern Shore or even Maryland for that matter.
But my family in New York, my mama called and said, I want to go to that Jonathan Street. I was, and then, you know, they were paying that much attention, and not even internationally. You know, I know you've been contacted as well from people, you know, on the other side of the ocean to speak on what can happen in this small street, this small town, and tell some of that history. So,
Yeah. Julie, I just want to say thank you for making archaeology cool. It is so cool. I've just enjoyed this entire process. Terrence still gets upset with me when I call myself Indiana Turner.
you didn't do anything.
I have the evidence. I had photo op with the trowel in my hand, and I am sticking to that. It is going on my resume that I have some man-hours in.
Yeah, he's like the guy that holds a shovel when they're cutting the pink ribbon and does one shovel full of dirt, and that's the picture you see, not the guy that actually builds it.
That's it. But that's not how I tell the story. So
Exactly.
we very much appreciate you coming. I know that you're going to do some other amazing things, hopefully in our community, and we'll have you back again.
Okay, good. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, that's all the time that we have for tonight. We hope that you'll like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and send us your comments to feedback@theflipsidetv.com. That's feedback@theflipsidetv.com. But most importantly, join us again next week for another episode of The Flip Side.